As we wait for our representatives in Congress to vote on pending gun control legislation that would have a national effect, many states have already acted. One of the strongest and quickest responses came from New York State, which passed one of the strictest gun control laws in the country in January. And it includes a controversial provision requiring providers of mental health services to report any patient who makes a credible threat of violence. So critics are concerned that such a provision stigmatizes the mentally ill and runs counter to the evidence that, in fact, the mentally ill are more likely to be the victim of a violent crime than the perpetrator. A new study released this week shows those with mental illness are 5 times more likely than the general population to be a victim in a murder. With statistics like that, it makes you wonder why our legislation is not seeking to protect them, the mentally ill, from us, the supposedly sane. And I think this, for me, Jonathan, is part of the question. Like, it feels to me like I hear people say, well, the one thing we can all agree on is that the mentally ill shouldn't have guns. And I'm thinking, well, how do you even define that? And why is that a problem?
Well, it's funny. I've been doing a lot of conservative talk radio over the past month. And actually, it's to the point of trying to reach out to people who might be NRA members but are disaffected with these extreme policies. And the prevalence of this thing of, well, at least we can all agree to get guns away from crazy people, to me is this incredibly entrenched historical stigmatization. And I think there are 2 real problems with it. One, as you've just suggested, is that people with mental illness are, as an aggregate group, very socially withdrawn, very seriously mentally ill people are odd. They're far more likely to be targets of violence than victims of violence. And so in a way, the stereotype of the crazy mentally ill person is at odds with what's really happening, which is that these people need protection more than anything else. And the second problem is really that there are terrific studies now about the lessons that we draw. Jeff Swanson does a bunch of work down at Duke. The lessons that we draw from mass shootings. And what we do is a lot of times we ask psychiatrists to become prognosticators. Right. And there's great research that looks at if you send 1,000 people that fit the stereotype of a mass shooter, angry, white male, paranoid, gun-owning, kind of, all the main categories, that psychiatrists really can't use diagnostic criteria. So really what we need to do is not ask psychiatrists to predict who will become a shooter, but instead to support the foundation of caring for people. The community of mental health is a far more successful strategy.
It feels like there's also politics here when we start saying, well, at least we can agree that the crazy people shouldn't have guns. That what it means is there's only a particular kind of shooting and murder that we're trying to keep from happening again. It's the Newtown that we don't want to happen again. But the idea of Pendleton, right, there isn't any particular reason to believe that person was mentally ill, at least in a classic sense.
Yes,
exactly.
Go ahead. I believe that America's response to gun violence has really troubling racial undertones. When the perpetrator is black, brown, or Muslim, America tends to diagnose the problem as a problem with an entire community, the threat of a people. When the perpetrator is white, we start talking about an individual problem, a personal problem, a problem of mental illness. When, as we know, only less than 5% of all violent crimes committed in the U.S. are committed by people who are mentally ill. And let's not forget last August when the perpetrator of the shooting in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, the gunman who opened fire in the Sikh Gurdwara, was likely motivated by hate.
Yes.
And so, the gun lobby, the NRA, pointing fingers to the mental health system actually is a tragically now effective diversionary tactic that further stigmatizes another group instead of putting the focus where it needs to be.
And it's no secret when you go to legislators that it's usually the conservatives and the Republicans who start talking about mental health as the real issue.
Yes.
And in my city, it's never, unless we're talking about community mental health, which I say is a huge issue, especially with young African-American males.
Sure, people kind of experiencing post-traumatic stress just from living in these circumstances.
Growing up with no dad, growing up where nobody has a job, or where nobody went to college, or nobody has any hope. There's just too many guns. I mean, that's the real issue. And I think the one thing we want to make sure of is America doesn't get distracted. And you mentioned in between sets about sequestration. The president has to come out. He has to stay out on gun control. Forget everything else.
Yep.
This is a moment in time.
Yep.
I told, I had to sit with survivors of Newtown and talk to them. We had a large Christian concert at our arena just down the street from the Newtown. And the parents told me, do not let our children have died without something happening to make sure it doesn't happen again. Right.
Don't let them die again on the sequestration fight, on these little petty battles that we've manufactured when something real.
We have the high ground. We have the moral high ground. We have the political high ground. The most important thing is that we focus on the magazine clips, the assault weapons, the trafficking, and the background checks. If we get those 4 things, we can change America, because America's awash in guns right now. There's more guns than there are people.
Right. And I think it's also important that we not only focus gun control on trying to stop mass shootings, because the mass shootings are the most dramatic, but it's the Hadia Pendleton type situation. I'm so glad you mentioned her. Those are the more common, or suicides, when you really are talking about a mental health issue, deep depression, and people who have a handgun. So I think that it's easier, and it's sort of more politic in a lot of ways, to just talk about crazy people who are doing a mass shooting, and if we can just stop that. But that's such a small percentage when there's the day-to-day degradation of just violence in inner city communities or suicides, where how do you deal with that? I mean, we're not going to do a bill that's going to touch handguns. A lot of the shootings that are taking place in some of these inner cities are gang related, so that's more of a policing problem. It's about rooting out sort of systemic violence within these communities, which is about mental health, but it's about a whole comprehensive thing. We don't even want to talk about poverty and all sorts of other things. But I think we can do what we can.
On our panel last night, when I said it was mostly young people at NYU, I said, there's always going to be a Second Amendment, and you're always going to have a rightful ownership of a gun. They're kind of like, oh, really?
Oh, yeah, right.
We're not out to change the Constitution. There's 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, and they're all equal. But no one amendment in the Bill of Rights should be more important than the next.
True. There may not always be a Voting Rights Act, but don't worry, there'll always be a Second Amendment. Thanks, Jonathan. Metzel, the rest are sticking around, because up next, I'm going to tell you the story about how I almost became a funeral director. Stick around.